We are back with more Frankenstein. It's a classic. Hope you guys remember where we left off. Frankenstein was, actually the monster was talking to Dr. Frankenstein, telling him his story. So we'll continue right there. Another event strengthened my bitter feelings against you. When I first came to my shed, I found your notebook in the pocket of the cloak I had taken from your bedroom when I ran away years ago. At first, it had no meaning for me, but once I could read, I learned of your work and your thoughts before you began creating me and while you were doing it. Yes, I learned of your horror at seeing my hideous body when you were finished. Why did you make me so hideous that you turned away in disgust? How I curse the day you gave me life, how I curse you. But my bitterness was softened when I thought of the kindly DeLacy's, who I was certain would befriend me and overlook my ugliness when I told them my story and when they came to know me as a good person. Still, even though I longed for kindness and sympathy from them, I put off introducing myself to them for fear that they too would turn away from me in horror. By the time I had been in the shed for a year, I started planning how to introduce myself to the family. I decided to enter the cottage when the old man was alone, since his blindness would prevent him from seeing my ugliness. Then I reasoned when his children met me, they would see that their father liked me, and they would too. One morning, after the young people had gone to the fair in the village, I saw my chance. I left my shed, and with my knees shaking and my hands trembling, I went to the front door and knocked. When DeLacy called, "Come in," I took a deep breath and opened the door. I introduced myself as a traveler in need of some rest, and the old man welcomed me. He even offered to share his bits of food with me. We spent hours talking about many things and agreed how important it is for a man to have friends. I truly believed that the old man had become my friend, and I was on my knees, grasping his hand in gratitude when the cottage door opened. I can't begin to describe the horror of the young people at seeing me. Safi ran out the door, and Agatha fainted. Felix lunged at me and with superhuman strength pulled me away from his father as I clung to the old man's knees. I fell to the floor, and Felix began beating me with a stick. I could have torn him apart with my bare hands, but I didn't. I just ran from the cottage in despair and didn't stop until nightfall, when I reached a thick forest. I was alone in the world again, with no friends, no human beings to talk to. My rage knew no limits. My brain wanted only revenge against the world and revenge against you, my creator. Chapter 13, A Confession of Murder. I set out to find you, remembering from your notebook that a place called Geneva was your home. Since geography had been part of the lessons Felix had taught Safi, which I learned as well, I knew I had to head in a southwest direction. My heart was filled with hate. You gave me a body, a mind, and feelings, then cast me out to be scorned by the world. I swore I'd repay the world, and you too. I traveled only at night. With winter fast approaching, snow fell all around, and the ground was icy under my feet. But I continued on all winter in spite of the weather. With each step, my rage against you grew. I traveled that way, avoiding villages and sleeping in open fields until spring, when I reached the Swiss border. I decided to enjoy the warm days and travel in daylight, but keeping hidden by following a path through the forest. One day, the path crossed a river. As I neared it, I heard voices. I hid behind a tree as a young girl came running by. She was laughing, as if playfully hiding from someone behind her. Suddenly, her foot slipped, and she fell into the river. The force of the current quickly pulled her out to the rapids. I jumped in, and with great exertion saved her. I dragged the unconscious child to shore and had just revived her when a man, her father, I imagine, tore her from my arms, and rushed back to the forest with her. As I started to follow them, he placed her on the ground, then turned to me, a gun in his hand. He took aim, then fired several shots. I sank to the ground in pain from the bleeding flesh and bone in my shoulder. This, then, was my reward for saving the child's life. I spent the next few weeks in the forest, healing my wounds and eager for revenge. Finally, I was well enough to continue on. It was early evening 2 months later when I reached the woods outside Geneva. I was tired and hungry as I sat down under a tree, deciding just how I would find you and confront you. I had just begun to doze when a beautiful young child came running towards me. A glimmer of hope flickered in my heart. Here was an innocent boy who probably hadn't learned to be horrified at ugliness like grown-ups were. Perhaps he could become my friend. I reached out and grabbed the boy as he ran by. As soon as he saw me, he covered his eyes and began to scream. I pulled his hands away from his face and said gently, "I'm not going to hurt you." "Let me go, you ugly monster," he cried. "Let me go or I'll call my father. He's an important man and he'll punish you. His name is Alfonso Frankenstein." "Frankenstein," I shrieked. "You belong to my enemy. Now I'll have my revenge. You will be my first victim." The child continued to struggle and scream terrible words at me. I grabbed his throat to quiet him, but the next moment, he lay dead at my feet. I realized then that this would bring misery to you, and I was glad. As I gazed down at the boy, I spotted the locket around his neck. I picked it up and stared at a picture of a beautiful woman. I knew that a woman of such beauty would never look at me, and my rage at you returned once more. I left the murder spot then, still holding the locket, and went on towards Geneva. I soon came to a barn, where I found a young woman asleep on some straw. For a moment, I was terrified that she would waken and see me, and surely be horrified at my ugliness too. And later, she could probably identify me as the boy's murderer. Even though I had no way of knowing for certain she would do that, I decided to make her suffer anyway. So I put the locket in the pocket of her apron, knowing that when it was found, it would point to her as the murderer. Once that was done, I hid and waited until the boy's body was discovered and followed everyone into the city. Later, I learned the girl had been arrested for murder. Then I began wandering through Geneva and through these mountains, waiting for the moment when I would come face to face with you, and now at last, the moment is here. Chapter 14, A Terrible Promise. The creature finished his story, then stared at me, waiting for my reaction. I was bewildered. One part of me was enraged by his crimes, while another part of me pitied him for the cruel way that he'd been treated by everyone, including me. I looked straight into those hideous yellow eyes and demanded, "So now that we're face to face, what do you want of me?" "I want a friend, someone who won't be revolted by my ugliness, but who will be as ugly as I am. Someone who will understand me and have sympathy for me. I want you to create that friend. Create a wife for me, just as you created me." My rage exploded. "Never," I cried. "I will never create another evil creature to commit the same terrible crimes you've committed. You may torture me or threaten me, but I will never do it." "I wasn't threatening you," he said in a calm voice. "I was trying to reason with you. Please understand that I tried to love my fellow beings, but all they have done was hate me, just as you have done. I still can't do it. I won't do it." The monster then began to rage, twisting his face into forms too horrible for human eyes to look at. "I swear I'll destroy you just as you have destroyed me, unless you agree to meet my demands," he warned. I turned away, but the monster pleaded again. If only I could be treated with a little kindness from just one person, I would repay that kindness to all mankind. I was moved by his argument. He was a creature who had feelings, deep feelings, and didn't I owe him something since I'd created him in the first place? Sensing my anger soften, he continued, "If you agree to make this woman for me, no one will ever see either of us again. We will go away, far across the ocean, to an uninhabited part of South America, and live out our lives without doing any harm to man or beast anywhere. I felt compassion and sympathy for him, and for the life I'd forced on him. But then, when I turned back to look at him, I felt my horror and hatred return. Then reason took over, and I figured that by doing what he asked, I'd be protecting all mankind from the evil he was capable of inflicting. Finally, after a long silence, I said, "I will do as you ask, but only if you swear that as soon as I've created this woman, you both will leave Europe forever." "I swear that you will never see us again," he cried. "Now go to the laboratory immediately and begin your work. I shall be watching you all the time. Even though you won't see me, you can be sure that I will reappear when the woman is finished." Then he turned and left, perhaps afraid that I would change my mind. I watched him descend the mountain faster than any eagle could fly over it. Soon he had disappeared in the snow and ice. It was dusk when I started down the mountain, weeping bitterly and raging at myself. We'd been talking the entire day, and it took me the entire night to make my way down the valley. I reached town at dawn and left immediately for Geneva. I knew I had to begin my dreaded work as soon as possible. All right, that's the end of chapter 14. We'll hit chapter 15 next week. Have a good weekend. Stay tuned.